Hi, I'm Ted Price from Insomniac Games. Today, it was my pleasure to talk to someone who's had a major influence on our industry through his creations, Leonard Boyarsky. He's the co-game director at Obsidian. If you've played any of the Fallout games, you have Leonard to thank for their existence. And of course, Leonard's newest game, Outer Worlds, is blowing up right now. Leonard talks about his inspiration, his approach to design and storytelling in giant games, and much more. Please join me for a deep dive into Leonard's vision for making masterpiece RPGs.
Welcome to The Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Leonard, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's awesome to have you here, and congratulations on the release of Outer Worlds.
Thank you.
I got to say, I have been nerding out big time on it. I've had a blast playing, and it is consuming my weekends now.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's always great to hear.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk a lot about it if you're okay with that.
Sure. Love talking about my games.
Okay. Well, we're going to actually go way back because I want to talk about how you got started and what has led you to this point with Outer Worlds.
Great. Yeah.
So when you were growing up, what were your favorite games?
I was actually not that much of a gamer growing up. I'm relatively old. So I was into board games. In about 7th or 8th grade, I asked for and got the, I think it was the first ADD or the second edition of ADD. It was one of the early ones. It was that box with I think it was the blue box, not the red one. But I didn't know anybody who played Dungeons and Dragons. So I spent a lot of time reading all the rules and imagining what a D&D session was. And strangely enough, my D&D sessions were all about role-playing and character building. It didn't have a lot of I'm going into dungeons and getting loot. So I had a very active imagination about how that would work. People who have played D&D know that you really have to play with people who have played before. Me and my friends would roll up a whole bunch of characters and get ready to play, and then we'd die within 5 minutes, and we're just like, we can't figure out what we're doing wrong. So that's where that started. And I loved, in high school, I loved Zork and I loved Wizardry. And that was about the extent of it at that point. And I went to art school. Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be an illustrator. I wanted to do surrealist versions of kind of like Norman Rockwell detail photorealism. So I went to art school. That was all I ever wanted to be, was like a freelance illustrator. And then right when I was graduating, they got a computer lab the semester before I graduated. And I'm like, I want to take that next semester, which was my last semester. And they're like, well, you have to take intro to computers first. I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that because then I'm gone. But for some reason, I immediately could just see the writing on the wall. I'm like, this is not good if you want to be a photorealist painter. No one's really going to need this in the future. So that kind of stuck in my brain, but I still went out and tried to be a freelance illustrator. I had very minimal computer experience. My parents had a Macintosh, one of the early Macintoshes, and I'd done a basic programming class in high school. But then a bunch of people who had graduated the semester before me, who were my friends, got jobs at Buena Vista Software. And after about 6 to 8 months of banging my head against the wall and really having nothing to show for it, I called them up and I said, hey, is there any positions open there? And I went and met with the guy, and I was living in Orange County at the time. I still am. And they were in Burbank, I think, which is quite a long haul. So I drove out there, and all I had was a portfolio of acrylic paintings, oil paintings. And I'm just like, well, I'll do it anyways. There's no way they're going to hire me. I have no idea my way around a computer or anything. And the art director, who was great, I wish I remembered his last name. His name was Jeff. He was fantastic. He said to me, I can teach you how to use a computer in a day. I don't have time to teach you how to be an artist. So he gave me my first break, and that was fantastic. I worked on a children's game for 2 months that had, as far as I could tell, no designers. I was the lead artist because I was the only artist, and I'm like, I did not have any idea what I was doing. And that got canceled because at one point, me and him and a couple of other people in our room redesigning the game, I'm like, well, this is interesting. I have no idea what I'm doing. So that got canceled. And then I started working on a game called Unnatural Selection, which was claymation dinosaurs or claymation genetically modified dinosaurs fighting each other. And so I did some interface stuff on that. I did a whole bunch of cutting badly blue screened claymation stop motion dinosaurs out of backgrounds and touching them up a pixel at a time, which actually led to me getting a job at Neverplay because at that point you kind of needed to have a little bit more experience doing computer art, but they really needed somebody to cut out badly blue screened characters for Stonekeep. So then after I did that for a while, for way too long, they had gotten some SGI machines, which were the top of the line at the time, and you needed those to run Power Animator, which was the precursor to Maya. And they forgot to look into how much it costs to hire people who knew how to use Power Animator because they were all working in the movie industry. And at the time, computer game salaries were extremely low. No one aspired to be in the computer game industry except for full-on computer game nerdy geeky guys. That wasn't a thing. I know Tim, my partner in crime, had his advisor tell him it was a mistake. I had my advisor, tell me, "Oh, don't worry, you'll get a real art job one of these days. Just make sure you stick with it." And these machines were just sitting in a room because they couldn't find anybody who could use them. So I'm like, I can't take this cutting out characters anymore. I had gotten to do some actual art, but most of the time I just kept getting dragged back into it. So I stayed after work for hours and hours and taught myself pre-internet with just a manual, sitting in a room by myself at like 2 a.m, trying to figure out how to do 3D art. And I was good enough, or I figured it out enough to actually do a lot of characters for Stonekeep. And then the art director on Stonekeep, who was, I'm assuming, going to be the art director on Tim's game, decided he didn't want to work there anymore, and he quit. And so they looked around and they're like, well, I guess, you have art degrees. You've done this for a little while. You can do it. And that's how I became the art director on what became Fallout. So that was my whole backstory right there.
That's awesome. Well, it's funny, as you're talking about all these things, our paths are very similar. Back in 1995, I was doing exactly the same thing in a reading through the Power Animator manual because we had just gotten our first 2 SGIs as part of our first game deal to make our first game.
Oh, fantastic.
And the same thing, it was...
NURBS.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No one else knows what we're talking about.
Right. I mean, and I thought the future was NURBS, actually.
I felt like, I'm like, you guys build stuff at Polygon at the time? You guys are crazy.
Right. But that's fantastic to hear. And so beginning Fallout was sort of the beginning of the beginning, really. I mean, beginning of where I think people know you. And arguably, Fallout has been one of the most influential franchises in the industry. And you and Tim, right, were working together on building that world and just bringing it to life.
Yeah. The third guy who started Troika with us, Jason Anderson, was also very instrumental in that. He spoke computer and art.
Okay.
I don't know how well me and Tim would have communicated at that point if Jason wasn't there to translate for us. He was very technical. He was a great artist, as well as a really good designer. So it was just a really good mix of all of our talents. And Tim was, most people, or I shouldn't say most people, a lot of people, if they're given the reins of a project, like you're in charge of this project, they immediately assume that they can kind of do everything. One of the first things Tim said to me is like, he's colorblind, and he's like, I know nothing about art, so just make it good. You do whatever you want. I'm like, great, that's fantastic. I asked him the other day, I'm like, why did you trust me so much? He's like, I didn't have a choice. But we clicked immediately because we were both very passionate about it. I remember he reminded me of this a couple months ago. I didn't remember until he told me, but he was running some people through a D&D module or a D&D dungeon that he had created. It was a very small, fairly small dungeon. And I watched him run 2 or 3 different groups through this dungeon this is when we were starting Fallout. And each one had a completely different experience on the same exact, map with the same exact layout and traps and, encounters and everything. And they were like completely different experiences due to how they were played. And I was talking to Tim afterwards. I'm like, can we do that in a video game? Why can't, that's impossible, right? Why hasn't anybody done that? And he was, he thought that was a great idea. I don't remember who came up with that first, but we were both talking about it. And I should say the other thing that happened was before, when I was still working on Stonekeep, he was actually running some GURPS games. And so I ended up playing those with him because I'm like, I got to play some D&D style games. I've wanted to do this my whole life. So we had some really great sessions. And that was right when he had convinced Interplay to make a GURPS game. And that was, Fallout was originally supposed to be a GURPS game. And ironically, I had picked him up from the airport after Christmas, like 1 year. We were already working on the game. And I said, this was before I had any input into system or anything. I was 100% the art director. And had a little bit of input into story. And I said, well, what do you think of the game? How do you think it's going? He's like, well, it's going to be a fantastic GURPS game, but I think having GURPS is kind of like really limiting what the game can be. And then, several months later, Steve Jackson decided he didn't like what we were doing, and we lost the GURPS license, and him and Chris Taylor redesigned our system from scratch. And luckily, GURPS is a generic system, so they had to build a modular system so they could just remove the GURPS module and put in a new one, or we would have been canceled at that point.
Wow. Was Steve coming over and looking at builds?
Yeah, it was really weird. We had shown him lighting people on fire with a flamethrower. He thought that was great. We'd showed him the project at several different stages. And he came over after we had finished the intro to the game. And he hated the intro, especially the execution scene, which I was very proud of. Me and Jason came up with that one. We thought it was hilarious, because we were young and callous, and he also hated the Vault Boy.
Why did he hate the Vault Boy? Because to me, that's one of the most iconic fixtures in the entire series. Don't know.
We said it's supposed to be like the Uncle Pennybags or whatever the guy's name is from
Monopoly.
Yeah, Monopoly. And ironically, I felt particularly targeted because I was the one who did the execution scene. Me and Jason did pretty much all the intro by ourselves with some help from some other artists, but most of it was done by us, from concept all the way to finish. It's still one of the things I'm most proud of. And we had this problem where we had icons that were way too small. I'd look at the game and I'm like, I know all the things you could do. I can't tell what the hell's going on. I'm looking at just a sea of icons. We need something else. And I had this long commute, and I just had this vision of Monopoly cards. And the next day I came in, I'm like, we need a skill dex. We need this thing where it's cards with your skills on them. So therefore we need a mascot. And I'm like, we got to come up with something. So I drew this real quick sketch of that character. So we tried to explain all this to Steve Jackson. He's like, oh, I get what you're doing. I don't like it. And we're just like, okay. And Brian Fargo, to his credit, we've had differences with him along the way. In the past, but at that point, he basically was on our side. He said, no, you guys, if you can take GURPS out of it, we'll stick with it. He could have easily just cut his losses. They had D&D at the time. They had just gotten the D&D license. So that was, it seems like when I look back on Fallout, so many things happened that were just luck. And it always seemed to be in our favor. So we learned a lot of bad lessons on that game. Oh, you have a problem with your skill system? Rip it out and replace it in 2 weeks and it'll be beloved. We did a lot of things. Like one of the main reasons we framed the intro the way we did is because it was so hard to do realistic people close up. So we're like, well, we're going to have this camera pulling out from the television. And by the time it gets to the part where people are in it, they're going to be kind of far away and it's going to be on grainy newsreel footage. And then the only real close-up detailed shot you see is of that power armor helmet. And I was just, for some reason, I just fell in love with that thing as I was making it. And I would go in on weekends and after work. And I made this really, really high-res version of it for no reason other than that I thought it was really cool. And it was in full color and it was just textured, the whole deal. And I made it just for the intro. And then we were working with an exterior marketing group, and we didn't like anything they were coming up with. And so me and Jason put together the cover of the box. And we're like, this is what we're going to do. And we're like, oh, that's how you do it. You go to marketing people that you don't like what they're doing, you just do it yourself. That doesn't happen either. It's like so many things that happened on that game. People giving us a budget and saying, yeah, go in that corner, don't bother anybody. We'll just, we'll leave you alone to do whatever you want. Never happens. I mean, even at the time, we knew that was a very fortunate and rare thing. But yeah, so we got just lucky break after lucky break. And we started out doing it didn't even occur to us to do anything different than we were just going to make an homage to the Road Warrior / Mad Max / Wasteland. And there's a lot of that still in there. But about, I don't know how long into it, another one of my long drives, I came up with the idea of the whole 1950s thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. To this day, I have no idea why I thought that was a good idea. And if people had really pushed me on it at the time, I'm not sure I would have been able to defend it. But Rob Nessler, who's art director at Obsidian now, the company's art director, I went in the next day and I'm like, hey, Rob, what do you think of this idea? And I told him, and he looked at me like he thought I was kind of insane. And he's like he totally didn't get it, but he's like, go for it, whatever. And then I told Tim, he's like, it sounds like a cool idea. And Jason was on board. And once again, that doesn't happen. You don't come up with this crazy off the wall idea that everybody kind of is like, we're not sure, but do it anyways.
Well, for small teams, that is, I think, in my experience at least, that does happen quite a bit when people. That's true.
That's a really good point.
And they say, we need somebody to own this, so go for it. I mean, to me, that choice of using the 1950s and that helmet that you designed, those are just such, again, iconic parts of this franchise, and also iconic parts of the industry as a result. I can't think of any other games that have tried to sort of tread in that same territory, which is fantastic, which means it really has lived on throughout the years, and it was a great choice.
I thank you. I appreciate that. I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. You're right. It is a very small team thing. And that's what's tough, because what was weird about that compared to like small teams now is like that was considered, pretty much AAA. I mean, it wasn't top of the line, but it was still in that, as far as RPGs were concerned, it was an A product. There wasn't even AAA concept at the time. So it wasn't like we were some weird small team off doing an indie project at the time. That's, I think, why it felt a little weirder. Yeah. But I tell a lot of people when they ask me, how to get in the industry, what should you do? I'm like, you should get on a small team somewhere. Even if you don't make any money from it, as long as you can support yourself, because you learn every aspect of game making. And it changed my career, not only because of that stuff, but because we were really unhappy with some of the writing that was being done on the game. And, the eternal cry of non-writers is like, I could do better than that. And that's what I said. But I went further than that and just started writing. And luckily, I had spent a lot of my childhood when I wasn't drawing, reading, so I could regurgitate my favorite authors in a fairly convincing way. And that's kind of like changed the whole trajectory of my career.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another great example, right? I mean, today, even on a small team, if you have somebody who says, well, I can just write that. My feeling is, and correct me if you think this is wrong, we do get tripped up by overanalysis, right? Yes. We start thinking about, that's not going to be good because A, B, C, D, instead of just doing it.
Yes.
It sounds like you guys had the let's just do it approach.
Yes, but we also had the if the person who was doing it couldn't do it, I would just do it approach, which leads to having no life and being there 24 hours a day. But when it's your first game and you're just looking around going, I can't believe they're letting us do this. We were still in that phase where, at least I was, where like, I can't believe I'm coming to work and getting paid every day to do this. Yeah. Don't tell anybody, but I'd be doing this for free. And just being able to be that creative and do whatever you wanted to was such a great, thrilling thing that we got very protective as well. And I don't think we were overanalyzing things. It wasn't like we'd reject things out of hand before they were in the game. It was always once things were in the game, if we didn't feel like they were up to the standard that we thought the game should have, that was when we started just taking over other people's work or trying to help them to do it better.
Sure. I mean, but that illustrates, I think, the solution, which is get it in the game. Let's just see it in the game. And before we start to kill it or even think about killing it. Yes. So many ideas, it seems today, especially with larger teams, can get killed because you've got 50 people who are second guessing it. And trying to imagine what it would be like.
Yes. And it's really hard, especially when there's more pressure or more eyes on what you're doing, because I can't count the number of times we had fantastic ideas that really didn't work, or ideas that we thought were just okay that turned out to be the thing that everybody loved. You can never tell until you see it in the game, until you play it. And having to defend those choices. Like I said, I could not have adequately told anyone why it was a good idea to make a post-apocalyptic 1950s game, other than like, it'll be really cool. Can't you see it? It'll be really awesome.
Well, I think, to give you more credit, I do think that using Mad Max as inspiration, right, a sort of a seminal genre-breaking movie is a really good idea, because then people can reference it.
Yes.
Right?
But where does the 1950s fit in there?
Well, that's the peanut butter and chocolate thing, right? Where two things that probably wouldn't go together can go together. And when you make that connection for people, that's when the light bulbs go off.
I think so. I mean, I love doing that stuff, obviously. I mean, if you look at the different games that we've made over the years, including The Outer Worlds, we just love starting with premises that are not standard.
Right.
Arcanum, our next game, was all about like, well, what happens if you have an industrial revolution in a world of magic? Because they always are stuck in the 14th century. And we're just like, what if you treated these like races? Everyone hates orcs, but if there's all this industrialization and orcs are part of this society, what happens to orcs? How are they treated? We always seem to return to this who has the power theme. It's like what we did again in Outer Worlds, and even in Fallout ended up being a lot about that. But in Fallout, it was like who had the power before the war, of course, and then there was the Master and the vaults and all that stuff. But it just became, I think, more pointed as we went, because it's such a, it's a basic human thing, all through civilization. It's always, who has the power and what happens to the people who don't have the power. But that just really fascinated us, how to, what would that look like? And we hadn't seen that before. So we're always trying to do things that are a bit different than I think other people would do.
One of the other things I think that's very different is that you do take these fairly serious societal themes and you inject a lot of humor into them.
Yes.
And that must have been, did you have arguments over that initially, or was that just one of those things where you said, I'm just going to go for it?
It's really funny, because that is the humor that started in Fallout is very much a combination of mine and Tim's personalities, as well as Jason and several other people on the team. A lot of the things that were in the game, we started designing the game. Tim had been working on the engine for a while, and he couldn't officially have anybody on his project. So he just said, he sent out a company-wide email. I'm going to be sitting in this conference room at 6 o'clock, which is, I think, 6 or 7 after work hours, and I'm going to have 2 big pizzas. If anybody wants to come help me design a game, come. And I showed up thinking, there's going to be 20, 30 people here at least. And there was like 5 of us. And so those 5 people, I put us in the manual as the original game designers, because we came up with basically what Fallout was going to be. That was before the 1950s stuff and all that stuff. But in terms of like the vaults, where we ended up in a lot of the story stuff, but especially in the humor, that kind of grew out of who we were. And that just kind of continued. Me and Tim referred to it as, the secret sauce of that style of humor is my dark worldview. I'm really into dark humor, and Tim's into more silly stuff. And I appreciate silly stuff, and he appreciates dark humor. But if we were writing in isolation or coming up with ideas in isolation, mine would tend more dark and his would tend more silly. So that's the peanut butter and chocolate there, as we put those two things together. And that's kind of how we, come up with the tone for these games and the humor.
Just because you mentioned dark humor, what are some of your favorite dark humor movies or shows?
I really love like some of the Coen brothers darker stuff. I love some of their silly stuff too, but I have a soft spot in my heart for some of their darker stuff. Brazil,
yeah, what a great movie.
which was an influence on this game, definitely. In books, like early Kurt Vonnegut stuff. I'm trying to think who else. There's a ton I'm probably not thinking of off the top of my head. City of Lost Children really wasn't dark humor necessarily, but it was just had a great aesthetic. So we all loved that while we were working on the original Fallout. Wes Anderson does some pretty dark stuff. Like one of the things I was trying to, when I was trying to get my writers and other people on the team to understand the tone, I kept saying, okay, imagine a sci-fi dystopia made by Wes Anderson and the Coen brothers. Because that was kind of the closest I could could think of something that was very close to that. Like Wes Anderson does some really, really sweet, touching stuff with this dark undercurrent underneath it. I mean, I loved the Grand Budapest Hotel. I thought that was, I love a lot of his stuff. I think most of his stuff, but I think that was where it kind of really, to me, had equal or a really good mix of both of those things.
Well, that's another great way to help the team get on board, right? When you make those connections even outside of games, and you can make those interesting and very unexpected combinations of pop culture with something that you guys are working on. That's always useful.
Yeah, we look to other games for, okay, here's kind of how the gameplay is going to be. In case you're not familiar with the kind of things we're talking about, here's some game touchstones. For me, at least, in terms of like tone and world and story building, I tend to not really look a lot at other games. Mm-hmm. There are, obviously, we'll look at games for how they use those things. But I feel like, there's hundreds of years of literature. There's, 100 years of great movies. Games are still so new. I mean, people are doing some really interesting things these days, especially in more independent games where they're coming up with some really interesting takes on it. But I feel like I don't want to disparage storytelling in games because I think there's a lot of great stuff out there. But I mean, it's the same thing in comic books. It's like when you read a comic book that's either drawn or written by somebody who's basically referring to other comic books as like that was their education. That's what they aspire to. It feels very kind of like empty and not, it doesn't have much depth to it. It feels very thin. And I feel like the same thing happens in video games. You can tell people who look at other things for inspiration and which games are kind of like, oh, this is just kind of a riff on this game idea that we've seen before.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's jump ahead to Troika.
Sure.
Because you mentioned Troika, and what was it like starting your own company?
It was really exciting at first. We had a very high opinion of Fallout when we left Interplay, and it took the world a little while to catch up. I think there was a lot of people when we went and talked to publishers. A lot of them were really happy about Fallout. They really liked Fallout. They thought it was a great game. But we just had this feeling built of youthful arrogance, I'm sure, that that it was something special. And so we went out there and just like, oh, we're going to get a contract. And it took us a while. For us, it felt like forever. And once we learned, we're just like, oh wow, it was like 5 months. That was a really quick turnaround to get a contract, especially when you're starting a company. But we had no idea. We were completely naive. And then we kind of quickly found out that you probably should have somebody to run your company because
you were CEO, right?
I was, but that wasn't because I wanted to. That was because no one else would be. And I definitely am not a business person at all. I was the person who would go out and try to get us contracts and negotiate us contracts. I'm like, I just want to be writing games. I want to be back, art directing games. And that was, that took a lot of our time. It didn't take enough of our time, which is why we didn't continue to get contracts. We should have been spending more time doing that. The first game was really fun, Arcanum, because once again, it was kind of like we were starting this whole new world from scratch. We were not, we were exploring different themes, different ideas. And, we were still really, really geared towards, the small team mentality. I mean, because Fallout was a fairly small team, I think at the biggest it was 25, 30 maybe, if even that. But most of it was, a relatively small team. It was only at the end when we needed to get a whole bunch of stuff done that it expanded. That we were just like, oh, we're going to make a game, a 100-hour game with 14 people. And that is not a good idea, especially a branching RPG. And we had Tim calls it our kitchen sink game. We had no discipline in terms of like, no, we're not going to put that in. Anything we thought of, we put in the game. I know I've gotten bad feedback from fans for saying this in the past, but I'd say things like, we put in the fact that if you played as a dwarf, you had a really bad magical aptitude. It was not a good idea to play as a dwarf who was a magic user, but we let you. Same thing with elves and technology. Now, I love that. I love that we gave players that option, but I look at that and I'm like, how much time would we have saved if we just said, okay, you're a dwarf, you can't use magic. That's just one random example.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing we never would have considered that. We're like, are you kidding? What if a player wants to play a dwarf who can use magic? That we have to let them do that. I think we always ended up with that. Well, we have to let players do that because they might want to. And and that was a lot tougher than Fallout because we were trying to get the game off the ground. We were trying to get the company off the ground. We were doing it with very few people, very few resources. It seems like the game industry kind of was kicking into high gear at that point. It was like the Fallout time was kind of on the cusp of like small games, and all of a sudden, games are selling 1 million units, which seems ridiculous now, but that was a huge thing. We're like, oh my God, that game sold 1 million units. That's the huge hit. And then like Warcraft came out and Blizzard became a thing, and it was very fast. It was just like, there's some real stakes here. When we first started it seemed like it was a much smaller industry, a much smaller mountain to climb, I guess, at that point. And then we quickly realized, no, we're kind of in the big leagues here having to do this.
I remember that. I mean, it happened so fast when CD-ROMs arrived, right?
Yes.
When we made that transition, and then everything exploded.
Well, Fallout was 640-480. I mean, that was just, what more could you want from a game? And then Stonekeep was when they switched over from floppy disks to CDs, and we're like, how are we ever going to fill a CD with content? We're just going to be stuffing things in that we found on the floor or whatever.
Well, so what are some of the lessons you took away from having run Troika?
I never want to run a business again. I think, people should really stick with what they're passionate about and what they're good at. I was not good at being a CEO. I was not good at the day-to-day business stuff. I did okay. I think I did okay for the position I was in. But you really have to be passionate about what you're doing, especially in those key positions. And I didn't want to do it. I wasn't like I was shirking responsibilities I had. I was shirking responsibilities that I didn't know I was supposed to have. So it wasn't like I was letting things be undone that we were all like, where's this? Why isn't this happening? We were doing, and when we say I was the CEO, that was just, I was the point man. Me and Tim and Jason made all the decisions, and everything was always unanimous with what we were doing and where the company was going. I was just the guy who had to go out and pitch us and make phone calls and that kind of thing. But there was a whole ton of things that I had no idea I was supposed to be doing, like continually finding contracts instead of spending my days writing dialogue for games, or art directing or whatever else I was doing concept art. I think the other thing we learned from not necessarily from running the company, but from games like Arcanum, it's like you have to pick and choose what you're going to do, especially in games that we want to give the player a lot of choice. You have to pick and choose where those choices are and how, where you want to put your time and effort. Way back in Arcanum days, I think we got more excited about the obscure ideas that like 1% of players were going to see. We're like, oh, if players do this will be so cool it will react. It's like, yeah, but did we maybe cut the corners or have to like not spend as much time on something that 90% of the players are going to see? I'd say there was definitely some of those instances where we just got so excited about things that players might find. That's not a good idea. I still love putting those things in, but you have to balance those things because it's always a choice. Even if you're working on a $100 million game, you still have to make choices. And when you're choosing to work on one thing, you're choosing not to work on something else, whether you make that conscious decision or not. And that's something that's really hard to understand. I mean, we've all looked at games that have come out and we're like, why didn't they fix this? They could have fixed this in 5 minutes. It's like, yeah, but what horrible bug or what great feature that we have or don't have wouldn't have been in the game or would have been in the game if they hadn't spent all that time that they could have been fixing these 10 things that would have taken them, a day or two at most. And it's really hard. I mean, making games is a very difficult thing. And I think I'm more cognizant of the bad lessons I think we learned on Fallout than I am lessons we learned at Troika, because we thought that, if you lined up all the pieces, lightning would strike again. And it didn't as well as it did for Fallout. And then we had issues getting our next contract. We had a game lined up and it just fell through. And it had nothing to do with the game. It had to do with other publishers, things merging and different things happening. And so we had to scramble. And Scott Lynch, who was the guy who signed us at Sierra, who published Arcanum, had gone on to Valve. And so he hooked us up with them and their source engine, which is the reason we got to do Vampire. I believe some of it had to do with us, but I'd say that was probably about 5%. Activision was really excited to be the second game to ever use the source engine. But the source engine wasn't finished. So all through Vampire, most of the way through Vampire, we didn't have a finished engine. And that's not a good way to develop a game, but we were desperate. We had to take a contract. It seemed like it'd be a really cool thing to work on. We were all excited about it, but we knew going in that was going to be difficult. And if you don't have somebody who's good at business, who's tracking down contracts, looking at different ways of funding things, just really spending their time looking at those things. Like I would look at a game design or a story design or art design, or Tim would look at a system design, looking at business that way. It's very hard to be successful because you can look at everything in life almost like a game. Like, how are you going to, get through school? How are you going to find a job? It's all like, where you're going to put your effort and figuring out the rules of the game. And you need to spend time doing that if that's your job, especially if you have 20, 30 people counting on you for their paychecks. And I wasn't interested in doing that. So I'm sure there's a ton of stuff if I sat and thought about it. I'm sure Tim could tell me a bunch of different things as well that we learned from Troika, but it was, he remembers a lot more from it than I do. Both Jason and I have talked frequently about how we don't remember a lot from Troika. We remember some of the high moments and some of the low moments, but some of the day-to-day stuff we just don't remember at all. It was just such a roller coaster ride, and especially at the end when Vampire started being really, really difficult, it just got to be really just very, very psychologically overwhelming.
Well, I think your lesson there for anybody who is starting a company is a great one, where you have to have somebody who is keeping an eye on the business and who's passionate about it. That's sort of the key word, right? You got to be passionate. And for all of us who get into games, generally that's not our first passion, right? Yeah. It's making the games themselves. So that's an excellent thing to impart.
It's always a trade-off because, if you want to have creative control, a lot of times you have to run the business. Yeah. But then who's going to run the business? It is trade-offs all the way, always.
So when you moved on, you moved into one of the biggest franchises in the world, right? Yeah. Diablo. And what was it like coming into something that already had a fan base and there were expectations that had already been built up around, presumably, that game?
Well, I took a year off between the ending of Troika. I sold my house and I lived on that. That was luckily right before the housing market dried up. So I was able to take a year off, which I thank God that I was able to, because I was not psychologically prepared to take on anything at that point. But it was really interesting because some of the people who were working at Blizzard, like Rob Pardo, had worked with us at Interplay. The first CES I ever went to, I was demoing Blackthorn, which was, I think, the last game that Blizzard made for Interplay. So it was still like this weird... Sure, they're this huge company, but they're also the guys down the street from us. Mm-hmm. So it was really, I took it seriously and I realized that there was a lot of expectations going into it, but I was also like, this is a game I'm going to make. This is just, I have to go in there and I just have to do my job. I was never really freaked out about the fact that there was all this weight of expectation. I'm like, I've been doing this for a while. You guys have been doing this for a while. We just got to go in there and make decisions and make the game, which is probably an extremely naive way to look at it. But I just felt like, if you spend a lot of time thinking about that stuff, you'll get frozen and you won't. I think you really have to go with your gut on things. And if you second guess yourself, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. If you really second guess it before it's in the game or before it's the thing you can really play or see, you're gonna make a bunch of bad decisions and lock yourself in. I think the beginning of Diablo was probably one of my favorite parts of it, because I was very involved in the like designing of the new world, the new parts of the world you hadn't seen before, the new cultures. I wrote a bunch of little short stories that went, or 1 page, half page stories that went up on the web when we announced, and that stuff was all really cool. It was a little frustrating though, because I was used to, and I still am used to, getting in there, just hitting the ground running. Let's go. Let's make decisions. Let's move forward. And I think there was a lot of people wanting to make sure we were making the right decisions. And I can totally understand that. I mean, you don't want to make a wrong decision when it comes to a franchise like Diablo. And maybe that's where I'm a little bit, naive. But I'm like, well, we have to move forward. If we don't look at these things in the game, if we don't get this game in a certain finished state, we can't like really, make those changes or really, judge what we have. And they were very iterative, which was cool. But at the same time, I felt like there were certain things that I don't think I think we abandoned before we should have. And I think that we could have pushed some of them further. And I liked some of our earlier stuff that we ended up abandoning. And I mean, obviously the way they make games is very successful. And I learned a lot about, iteration and polish there. And it was very interesting to see how other people made games. But maybe it's just because we came from very, a small studio. Even at Interplay, that was a huge studio, we were a very small team. So you just had to get in there and get things done. And I feel like that after a while was a little bit tough for me, because I just wanted to keep moving forward. Let's move forward. Let's make decisions. Let's move forward. And it was a very slow process. I mean, we took 6 years to make an action RPG.
Now, did you get in at the very beginning of development?
Yeah, they had rebooted it literally a month before I started.
Wow. Okay.
So I was in there on the ground floor, and I thought that we came up with some really cool ideas very early on. And like I said, I mean, I've never had a franchise like Diablo riding on my back, so it's very easy for me to say these things now, because I wasn't in some of those big meetings where they were making huge decisions about the franchise. It was just me going, yeah, let's go. Let's put this together. Let's see what we got. And being really excited about it. And I don't know anybody who can maintain their enthusiasm over 6 years for a project like that. I mean, 3 years is enough.
Yeah. Well, do you think that over those 6 years you evolved as a storyteller and a designer?
I think so. I think I became more aware of what I wasn't good at. I did a lot of research and writing, and really examining how I approached writing and how I approached story design and world design. What I really hadn't given a lot of thought to it before. I just kind of did it. And there's something to be said for naively just doing something, if the amateurish approach or the amateur approach. And it worked out pretty good for me up until that point. But there was a lot of things that I learned during that process, whether from the people I worked with. I had a really great lead on Reaper, Brian Kindergan, who had worked at on Mass Effect at BioWare, but he had also been a storyboard artist. And so I had some fantastic conversations with him about storytelling and writing. So there was a lot of really interesting things I learned, and things, the way they approach things. I'm trying to think of an example. The fact that they like to keep it polished as you go and have a game up and running as quickly as possible is huge. I don't think that that's a big revelation to anybody. And we were lucky on Outer Worlds. We got the game running fairly quickly, which was one of the earliest, except for Diablo, that we've ever had that experience. It was always a while before you had like a really playable game that didn't feel like half of it was missing. So I think that's pretty much it. And also looking at the enormity of a project like that, and knowing like, yeah, I don't necessarily know that I want to work on or be in charge of $100 million franchise. I mean, I enjoyed a lot of my time there, but I like not young, definitely not in my case. I like smaller, scrappier stuff that you could just really like sink your teeth into. Just to me is much more viscerally appealing, I guess.
Did Outer Worlds start out small and scrappy?
Yes, it was me and Tim in an office together. Okay. Working on it. You can't get any smaller and scrappier than that. I guess if I was working in the office by myself, or Tim was, So anyway, so Tim wanted to make this game, and he told them, which I'm very thankful of. He said, I can't make this game without Leonard, because he knows he's good at like half of the game, and I'm good at the other half, and we're very, very aware of our shortcomings and where our strengths are. So he convinced them to hire me, and then we just basically sat in a room and started coming up with ideas for the game.
That's cool. And so how long was it until it was a real thing? Meaning, okay, now we've got to add a team, start prototyping systems, really get this up and running.
The first 2 or 3 months was just Tim and I writing up game pillars, writing up design docs, coming up with the basic outline of the story, me kind of starting to investigate where we might want to go with the art style. We hired some external freelance artist, or a couple of them, different ones, to kind of explore some ideas that way. And then we started pitching to publishers. It wasn't until we started working with Private Division, I think, that we started actually into full pre-production, meaning more than me and Tim sitting in an office. We got Charlie Staples, our lead designer, very early on, and Daniel Alpert, our art director, who I love to tell the story about how he started out as an intern at Troika. So that was nice to be able to work with him again. They came on fairly early, but it wasn't until we got, we signed with Private Division, or at least signed to make a prototype for Private Division, that we really had a team start to come together. But that was about 3 months in, I think.
Okay. And was the pitch fairly light on things? I mean, the reason I ask is because pitches can be everything from a game that's halfway made, right, to a couple slides.
Yes.
Where did you guys fall on that spectrum?
We had a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
I took a bunch of art off the web, and like with the preamble of like, this is not what it's going to look like, but showing the very, the industrial, the mechanical nature of everything, the very low tech kind of feel we were going for, representing how a lot of that stuff would work. And ironically, one of the artists I used extensively in our PowerPoint presentation, like one day I was on Facebook and I saw, this was really early on, I saw that he had left the company he was working at and he was going freelance. And I immediately messaged him and I'm like, we want to hire you. And he did the computer you see everywhere. That was his piece. I worked with him on that. And that was kind of really the thing we started building the game around. But beyond,
that's kind of interesting. So that helped drive the visual style of the game, that piece, that prop in the game.
Yeah, because what happened was I hadn't done 3D art in a really long time, and that was how I concepted back on Fallout, was just going straight to 3D. When I was, like I was saying earlier, I was into photoreal art, which meant I was taking pictures of things, and so I started to teach myself some real, like, I don't know if it was Blender or SketchUp, one of those programs, but it just really was taking me a little while to get into it and kind of really get the flow going. And so, but I knew what I wanted. So when I started working with him, he was fantastic. He took direction great. He had a lot of great ideas on his own, but that was something where we could put it in front of other people and say, this is a piece of the universe. This is kind of like what we're going for. 'Cause unlike, it's easy to say, oh, this is a 50s post-apocalyptic thing, but we were kind of like merging a lot of other different things, a Gilded Age in space, low tech, sci-fi pulp physics kind of thing. So there's all these different things we were trying to mix together. I mean, when we made Fallout, I don't even know if steampunk was an official thing at that point. I think it might have been. I'm always embarrassed. When we started working on Arcanum, people kept asking if it was steampunk, and none of us knew what they were talking about. That was when we first heard about steampunk.
That's interesting. It's a great question. I have no idea either.
I think it probably was.
Well, so there was Cyberpunk back in the 1980s.
Yeah, but to me that was before punk was being affixed to everything.
Yeah.
Cyberpunk made sense because it was like punk rock and Blade Runner, which Blade Runner had a bit of punk rock in it already. So I thought that was just a great way to term it. And then steampunk came along, which had a little bit less of the punk rock
Right.
look. I understand the ethos is punk, but the look of it doesn't have a lot of punk in it. And then all of a sudden there's like atomic punk, diesel punk. It's like any kind of punk you can imagine. And I'm like, well, I guess I feel very proud that we were to the party early with what I guess now is called atomic punk. But at the same time, it's just like, well, it was really fairly easy to be like, oh, 1950s, post-apocalypse. We'll just put those two things together. It's like we couldn't do that anymore, because if we said, oh, here's an era and we're combining these two ideas together, chances are next week somebody else is going to come up with the same idea. So we really had to kind of dig a little bit deeper this time and really think a lot about aesthetically what we wanted it to feel like, and kind of work backwards. Like, what does this mean? What are the sociological implications? So therefore, like, how would that inform what our art looks like? Tim originally started developing the corporations and the silly aspects of the corporations. And then when I came in, I started doing things like, he already had come up with Spacer's Choice and Taste the Freedom I think he had. And then I go, oh, well, they're obviously a division of this thing called Universal Defense Logistics, and they operate this prison, the biggest prison in the colony, because of course, if their slogan is Taste the Freedom, they have to operate the penal colony. So we started doing things like that. Tim was getting really into the corporate stuff, and then I started thinking about, okay, well, we have all these corporations, do they run this colony? And so we got, oh, yeah, they probably run the colonies. It's kind of like Vault Tech on steroids, And that was when we really just started talking about, like, okay, what does that mean? And then we started talking to some other people, and the idea came up about the mining towns from the turn of this 19th to the 20th century, where employers basically owned everything. They paid you in company script, but you could only use it at the company store. And we're like, okay, they have basically those towns in space. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And then, of course, we wanted to work the frontier aspect into there. And we really hit that hard in terms of like the way people talked. I really, I loved the original book True Grit, as well as the Coen Brothers version of it. I thought that was fantastic. I wanted to incorporate some of that idea in there. And then, of course, Deadwood and Firefly itself. So we just kind of started putting all these different things together. And then out of the mining town thing and the fact that it seemed like these corporations were completely unchecked, we kind of started tracing that back to the robber barons. And that's where we came up with the whole thing about Teddy Roosevelt never becoming president, which I've said this many times because I think it's just hilarious. Because we originally just kind of pulled, oh, this is kind of like it's split off in the 1920s around after Einstein has published his first stuff, but hadn't gone really any further. But then when we started thinking about it, from a political standpoint, it became very obvious that William McKinley hadn't died and Teddy Roosevelt never became president. And because they put him in the vice presidency to completely just sideline him. He was never supposed to be in any power whatsoever. They did that on purpose. And then ironically, an anarchist killed McKinley, which is ironic because we'd already started saying that the board calls all these people anarchists in the game. And so it was just kind of one of those things that fell in our lap, and we just laughed about it. We're like, oh, okay, that's where we're putting that pin in the timeline. And then after we announced, some fan on Reddit said, well, it's obvious what happened here. And then he said that whole thing. And that was when we started saying, yes, that is definitely what happened. But we probably never would have even talked about that, at least in this game. Because we like to drop a lot of hints.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily want to go, here's an encyclopedia entry that's telling you how it got to be here. Yeah. We want you to have to sift through a lot of unreliable narrators. We feel that that's more interesting.
Well, it certainly creates mystery. I mean, that's one of my favorite parts of the game, is that it feels like every conversation you have leads to another mystery. And thank you. I'm glad it feels that way. And I usually, as a RPG player, I'm not looking forward to the dialogue trees and having just to mine them for the next quest. But I felt constantly entertained with every single NPC I talked to, because I was always being surprised by something they would bring up, or some sort of hidden reward, which required some mining, but that mining was always entertaining because of the dialogue you're talking about, right? I'm fanboying now. I apologize, but there's consistency to the vernacular and the dialect that you're using throughout the game that that it's hard to see in other games. And so going deep on the dialogue, how did you maintain that consistency between different groups and also sort of overall for this world you've created, given that you have what, 50,000 lines of dialogue in the game or something along those lines, right? Something crazy.
Yeah, something like that, as well as, all the written text.
Yeah.
On top of that. Well, thank you for saying what you said. First of all, that was one of the mandates we had, or I laid out early, is that if you have any kind of info dump in the game, it has to come when the player is like going, I want to know. So it seems like a reward as opposed to, God, the designers really want me to know this here. So that was one thing that we really tried to do. So, and it sounds like, at least to you, it feels like we succeeded a little bit.
Absolutely.
And the other thing was we always tried to get people. We hoped people would want to play through the dialogues, but we always tried to give them fairly quick ways through if they wanted those. Like we often put in what we called the cut to the chase. And there were several times we actually just have the player say, cut to the chase. I'm tired of listening to you. In terms of the tone, number one, it's like we have fantastic writers. And we started with only 3 writers. None of them had worked at Obsidian before. So I was able to corrupt them from the get-go.
What specifically did you tell them coming on board to get them in the right state of mind to write that, I'll call it, very sophisticated, humorous approach?
We talked a lot. I talked to them a lot about the influences, like Brazil, the True Grit, the Firefly, the Futurama references. Simpsons was always a huge one with me and Tim. So we talked a lot about that. And then we did a vertical slice, which is basically just a chunk of the game, which is one area, which was the Roseway area was our vertical slice. And I wrote the main character in there to kind of give them the feel for it. And I don't think I actually did all that good of a job writing in the style that I wanted them to write in. I thought they really outpaced me on that, which I was very happy about. I'm like, I love it when I work with people who do things better than I do. So it's kind of ironic me going like, no, it needs to be more like this. And, I wrote this character who didn't necessarily have as much of it as I would have liked. But I really wrote that character to kind of just show the way we wanted the reactivity to feel and the depth to feel and the way you had to peel back the layers of the onion to get the information if you wanted it. So I think that helped them, seeing me showing them what I was looking for. As far as the writing stuff, I just kept, if I didn't feel that they were hitting enough of those notes, I would just, basically give them that note, and I would suggest things. I'd do some research, kind of figure, well, here's some words, maybe you should throw in there. We came up with some, a list of words or phrases that people seem to use in those, whether it's books or novels or TV shows we'd seen. So we kind of learned together how to approach that. And it's difficult because if you're going to write a game with fairly contemporary dialogue, it's kind of easy to riff on that stuff. It's kind of like we have to translate it. It's like we have to write it, do a kind of like a rough pass, and then kind of like put it through the Outer Worlds filter and kind of add that layer to it. And there's a lot of back and forth between the writers and between me and the writers. And I can't praise the writers enough.
How many did you end up with?
Well, we start off with 3, and then one of the writers had to leave for personal reasons about halfway through the project or 3/4 of the way through the project, and then we got 2 more. So at one point we had 5, and then technically 7 writers worked on not including me, worked on the project as a whole. For most of the project, we had 4 to 5. Okay. And then at the end, we had 2 writers come in and really help us out. And that was, I think, the hardest thing for all the writers was to kind of get into that flow and even beyond the vernacular, it was really hard for writers to get their heads around that the world was not our world. I can't count the number of times I had to be like, there's no internet. This is, you can't, this doesn't exist in this universe. And some of them slipped through. I found a couple recently. Oh my God, I missed those. And we did some really archaic things with how they referred to things. And a couple of writers kept trying to figure out, like, exactly how the science worked. And I finally just said, look, let's talk about Firefly for a second. They're not flying a spaceship. They're driving a truck around to different towns. And they're like, oh, because they kept trying to figure out how we were putting this thing together at a, on a science level. I'm like, it's like 1950s pulp sci-fi. So in having them learn what we wanted the rules of the world to be. And I've done this too. I actually did this in art. I was always looking for deeper meanings or deeper reasons for doing things. So I understand where they're coming from. But a lot of times I always just be like, no, this is just flavor. It's like when people read this stuff, they're going to get a very interesting feel for how the world is. It doesn't need to have this deeper, intricate reasoning behind it, whether it's, how the science works or whether other things. A lot of that stuff we would work out in-house that we would never talk to the players about or tell the players about. But a lot of it was really like, we just want kind of like that feel, the feel of this archaic machinery, the feel of how, if you want to go faster, you just need a bigger engine.
That is a great explanation for why I feel the way I feel when I play the game. I'm not reading these long texts about the world's history or how things work. I'm getting very personal anecdotes to help fill in the blanks, which to me illustrates the difference between Outer Worlds and, say, Skyrim, right? Where there are lots of RPGs out there that will give you that just on the nose, here's how this world evolved versus the personal accounts. And to me, that creates a very different. You just helped me understand why I like the game so much.
Oh, well, I think, that going back to my point that I made earlier, which I hope I didn't offend people by saying, about looking to other inspirations or other genres or other medium for inspiration. I feel like, in writer's circles or, when you look at creative writing blogs or take creative writing classes, there's a lot of discussion about what's more important, plot or character. And some writers it's like all about the characters.
Yeah.
And some writers, it's all about the plot. And generally when you get more into literature, it's way more about the characters and how the characters interact and much less about some kind of overarching plot.
Yeah.
And now obviously by their very nature I was going to say RPGs, but games need a plot. If they have a story, they need a plot because that's how you're going to drive the player forward. But my contention with this, and this is another thing, you wouldn't think I'd have to like put as much work into convincing the writers of this, but I did because many of them had already worked on other games writing, and they loved writing characters. But I kept saying, even if some of the details here fall a little flat, if you write a really entertaining character, you can. A lot of sins will be forgiven if you give people entertaining characters. Not that I thought that we had a lot of story problems, but if people really weren't clicking with certain part of it, I'm like, no, here's a very simple version of it, and just give me an awesome character that's going to be telling the player about this, that's entertaining in and of themselves. And I think a lot of games are hesitant to really focus on the characters because like I said, it's very easy to get really, really laser focused on the plot. Because that's how games unfold. It's all the plot. Where I really wanted to be like, I want to tell a good story, but one of the things that's just as important to me is us having this world that's based around characters, that's built from characters. And there's a lot of talk, and obviously it is obviously a condemnation of late stage capitalism to a certain degree. But I also was very adamant that it's not just about that. It's about, like we said earlier, people who wield power and how people choose to wield power. Systems, you have to have people running systems. You don't have systems without people. So you could have the best system in the world and it's going to be horrible if it's run by horrible people. A great example on the other side is like I don't think a monarchy is a good thing, but if you have a really, a philosopher king, who's, benevolent dictator, that's probably way more effective than a democracy sometimes. I don't think I would want to live in that. But, I could see, especially in a fictional setting, where I could make a probably pretty, and a lot of, fiction, fantasy fiction deals with, kings who are righteous. So if you're positing that and you're saying, this is how this fictional world works, that this is a righteous ruler, I don't think they're trying to tell us that we should return to monarchy and feudalism is the way to go.
Well, I what I like, and correct me if I'm off here, I felt like a lot of the characters, the sort of the morally gray and maybe morally even further down the spectrum, characters justified their motivations well, right? You could tell that they, at least for me, I could tell they sort of believed in their motivations and had become so sort of focused on what their ultimate goals were. It came through as authentic when they're explaining why you have to go do something and why they don't care about the negative ramifications of it. That to me made those characters more believable. And even though it's in a video game, I felt they became anchors for me. Again, I'm fanboying out here, so I apologize.
Well, no, I appreciate that read to you that way, or that affected you that way, because that was our goal. That was really what we wanted to have happen. I mean, if you side with the board, we were never going to be like, oh, the board's a great option. The board's, but we wanted, like, when you started interacting with the board, we wanted it to be this thing where they were believable within the context of the world. They were believable characters who were really committed to what they thought. They were doing what they thought was right. Yeah. And they had their reasons. And within the context of the world and with the context of who those characters were, you had to believe that they believed it. Yeah. And that was very important for us. Once again, we weren't trying to say, we weren't saying that we believe this argument, but there's a lot of nuance in the world, in the real world, and we like to add at least a level of nuance into our worlds where it's never cut and dried. There's things in this world that I could probably say I feel are fairly cut and dried, but that's my own personal opinion, and I don't want to be lecturing our players. But I feel like, to me, if we can add a layer of that, it not only adds to the player experience, it might make people think a little bit about certain things. And even if it doesn't, I feel like it does make for a better experience.
Well, you definitely allow, I think, the player to draw parallels with real life figures. I mean, not that so far I haven't seen anything in the game that is a direct reference to a real life character, but it does make me think about a behavior that's exhibited in our world. And it just because it's presented in a way that's relatable in the game, right? You don't have archetypes that are so just out there that players just can't get it.
Well, and I also didn't want to have a lot of real world analogs. And I'm much more cynical in the real world than I am in our world, because in our world, I'm like, I want every person you meet, even the most despicable person on the surface, to have redeeming qualities. And a lot of times we would put, like, I don't know how far you've gotten through Edgewater, but the company boss there. How far have you gotten in Edgewater? I don't want to spoil anything for you.
I'll play dumb at this point. I'm outside of Edgewater. Like I've already gotten done a whole bunch of quests that are based in Edgewater, and I've been exploring way out.
Okay. Have you talked to Reed?
Yes.
Okay. So, he comes across as a character where you're just like, okay, this guy's totally bought into the company line, the party line, and he's really kind of despicable in a lot of ways, and you're just like, I really don't like this guy.
Okay, so I had a different perspective on him.
That's good.
So yes, he's despicable in some ways, and you can kind of see through his veneer, but I also got it. I got that he had a job to do, and he's very focused on accomplishing that job at the cost of the townspeople, right?
Well, that's good, because we wanted that, but there's also a nobility to him that you'll find, hopefully you will find. Yeah. And we really wanted that, because I didn't want characters who were just like, oh, these are straw men that we're setting up these archetypes from the real world and just arguing against them and making them buffoons. And ironically, I would talk to my writers and I would say, okay, this is a character that most people are just going to sympathize with right off the bat. They have to have something that just makes him horrible, or vice versa with Reed. I'm like, okay, this guy can come off like the biggest ass and you're not going to like him. I want him to be a very noble individual. He could be like an idiot. He can be like, you don't agree with him at all. But I want, at his core, him to actually come off like a noble guy who's doing what he thinks is best for the town. And he's really committed to it, to the extent that he would possibly give his life for the town because he cares that much about it. Whereas, the other people who you might think are like, oh, these guys are the people who are returning to nature and they're doing it right. Their leader can be kind of vindictive and kind of not. She's nice on the surface, but like when you start digging down, she's got that other layer. And once again, I mean, I don't think it's good storytelling to have thin characters and straw men. But I also think it's fun as a player to be able to like dig, if you're into that, digging into the layers of those characters and finding out contradictory things and finding out deeper things about them.
Well, I think that once I started digging into the first just couple characters that I met, it gave me the incentive to do that for every NPC I met. And that has been a breath of fresh air for me, given that a lot of the characters I encounter in games, I am mostly just looking for, hey, what do you have for me? What am I going to get from talking to you versus, oh, you have a really interesting story. And it's not the same story that's been repeated. So looking at the more practical aspects of what you all were to accomplish, how did you manage to keep track of these just crazy numbers of stories and sub-stories and connections between all of the characters?
A lot less accurately than you would probably suspect.
Magic.
Yeah. No. Well, first of all, Obsidian has a fantastic dialogue and quest tool that is a visual flowchart.
Okay.
I mean, when we made Fallout, I would write dialogues in a Word doc, if Word was even around then. I'd write it into some sort of document and give it to the scripters who would have to actually script every line. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we're not talking about scripting like a screenplay. We're talking about junior programming, basically. And sorry if I offended any scripters out there. I love scripting, by the way. I think it's really fun. I don't do nothing.
It's efficient.
It is.
Right?
And
you can get a lot done very fast.
You come up with some great ideas. I mean, that was one of the things when I was working Diablo, I actually got a chance to, and Arcanum, I got a chance to do a lot of scripting. I think I came up with my best ideas when I was actually implementing them. Like, oh, I could do this instead. But anyways, where was that? What were we talking about?
I was asking about just the system, and you were saying that Obsidian has a great
so they
dialogue tool.
so in Arcanum we were using Excel.
Okay.
So imagine like scrolling up and down in Excel trying to figure out where your branch is going from and to. Nice. So we have a visual flow chart where you see the player responses, you see where it links back together, you can visually see where these paths are. So in terms of specific dialogues, you can see that. The other thing is we have very extensive design docs for every area, and a lot of it is just day-to-day communication between the teams who are working on it. There were a lot of times where we found we had missed things, whether we hadn't accounted for something that needed to be accounted for, or whether we called them data points. There were certain data points we wanted to litter around in the story, in the world, to make sure players were getting specific pieces of information that would become important later in the game. And we missed a lot of those because it's a lot of moving parts. And so we kind of would go back in and put them in later. And I think the writers did a fantastic job of covering those. And I think some of the most memorable ones are ones that we had missed and they had to go back in and kind of backfill them, which is not how I would think it would have worked. I would have thought those would be the weakest. And we do have some that I'm like a little bit cringe when I see, because I'm like, that feels to me like it's really shoehorned in. But I think some of the things that they came up with to kind of illustrate the things that I felt we had missed the first time around, I thought were great and were way better than ideas I had originally when I thought we were going to be putting it into the game, those things into the game.
So it came down to being able to do it fairly fast and efficiently.
Yeah, and play through it. We have talked frequently as developers about doing what we call a horizontal slice. The vertical slice is like one area. Horizontal slice is being able to play the game in a very, very rough state from beginning all the way to the end, including the choices you get to make in the main story arc. Not a lot of side quests, but the main story arc. And we did that on this game. And that immediately showed us where our story didn't work, where the choices the player had to make weren't working. It was really helpful. And then once we had that in and we start like replacing those pieces with more polished pieces, you could still, I mean, obviously there was times where things just broke because we took out big chunks or moved chunks around. But for the most part, you could play the game, and you'd get stuck periodically, but you could play a big chunk of the game at any one time and see how those things were playing out. And this was the only time in my experience, I mean, I was going to say Fallout, on Diablo to a certain degree, we did it as well. We had obviously a long development time, so we were able to do it. But in terms of the game me and Tim have made together, this was the first time we were able to really play for extended periods of time very early in development and figure out where we were missing those things. Mm-hmm. I hope as we move forward, we will continue to develop better tools for tracking all of those things. But I think the best way is to be able to play the game and to be able to play big chunks of the game. And you start to get a feel for what's missing and what's not. What did we hit? What did we just really overemphasize and it's just going to tire the player out? And what did we completely miss? Or what do we have to hit the player over the head more with? Yeah. And you can theorize about that all day long, but until you play it in the game, you're not going to really know.
So I'm going to ask more of a meta question about branching stories. So given the depth of your system and what feels like infinitely possible outcomes, which there aren't, right? Do you think there's game makers can eventually deliver on that promise? Having a world with lots of characters, lots of potential directions, and lots of very different outcomes in terms of the player's ultimate path?
I think,
because usually games that you come back to one point, right?
Yeah,
at the end.
There's a couple different answers to that. Number one, if somebody wants to put enough time and money into it, you could get a lot more varied. Imagine if we had twice the budget and say another year of development. I feel like we could have added a lot more of those kind of things. We could have.
But I guess I'm not asking. I'm right. I think money is usually, and time is usually the answer to that question. But I guess I'm wondering is, given that budgets continue to go up for everything, it seems like that goal, if that is a goal for some people, is receding even further.
The second part of my answer was yes, because you can keep throwing money at it, but the more money you throw at it, the more you're spending time making, perfectly modeled characters and cinematics, and that just eats up your budget too. Yeah. So the second part of my answer was, we will be able to do that when we have actual AI of a sort. It doesn't need to think for itself, but where we could go in and set parameters. I mean, obviously we had real AI that could just do it, and we just said, this is the character, run with it, and here's how they talk. We'd be out of jobs. But I'm talking about even a rudimentary where we could input into, here's a character, and we put in like, okay, here's their characteristics, here's kind of how they talk, here's some, write a couple hundred lines of dialogue or something to show how they, how they talk, how they, how they use grammar, how they frame their responses, and then the computer would just run with it, and the player could literally say, not even have a list of things to pick from, but actually be able to say what their responses are and have the computer respond in real time. The problem with that is then you have to somehow account for that. And I don't know how that step happens. I mean, just in terms of dialogue, I can't see, now that I've explained that part of it, that's only obviously like not even a third of the equation, because forget about even the bigger stuff. It's like, how then these characters would be building on each other, and you'd be off in the woods very quickly. So maybe. I
mean, maybe AI helps solve that problem too.
Or you put some parameters on it and tell it where it needs to kind of turn back from the edges.
Yeah, because I mean that subtle, those subtle boundaries, presumably one could teach AI how to institute those as well.
And maybe even put in like, okay, eventually you need to direct the player through this choke point. Yeah. That could have like 50 outcomes where now we can only give you 3.
Right.
I mean, that's probably the intermediate stage of like going from, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we had at least, in the main story arc, you could talk your way through, you can fight your way through, and you could stealth your way through. And even then, you might have to, even if you're a talk character, you're probably gonna have to sneak around some of the monsters because you're not going to be talking to them. But even then, so at the very least, we had to have 3 ways of solving it. So let's say we wanted 50 ways of solving it or 25 ways of solving it, and the game reacting in a very impactful way. But then you're into things like whether you have how do you construct your like cutscenes for those instances. And once again, the more we can get the computer to handle those things, the more we can program in parameters or put in parameters. Like we want this to happen. Because I mean, we could sit around and come up with like 50 different ways that a player could solve a problem and cool things that could happen when they solve the problem. We just can't implement them. And then of course, tracking those things becomes much more difficult. But if we had lists of those things and all we had to do was sit around all day long and talk about how cool it would be if the player did this, if he then did that, we would still have to rein it in at certain points because our brains can't handle that, But even then, you start feeding that into something that can process all that and give you answers. We could be like, okay, what did we do for the past 5 things? What are our options now? And then we riffed off those things. I think once we get to that point, we'd all quickly be out of jobs.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, well, my personal opinion is we are so far away from even being able to use AI in a rudimentary sense for writing dialogue or vocalizing in games that we got a ways to go before we're out of jobs. Well, but it's exciting. I mean, to me, it's the potential is really exciting. Just given the brute force that goes into these games right now.
Well, and I don't want to suggest that I don't want to work with voice actors because I think voice actors are spectacular. I mean, if you get good voice actors, which I feel we're very fortunate to get some fantastic actors for this game, they bring so much to the character.
They really do. Another compliment to Outer Worlds. The voice acting for even the more minor NPCs is great. It's another consistency that exists in the game.
Yeah. So I love working with voice actors. I mean, they can make even, and the converse is true. If you get a bad voice actor, they can make even the best written line sound bad. But if you get a great voice actor, they can make you sound like such a 5 times better writer than you actually are, because they bring a humanity. They bring something that they bring their talent basically to it. You have a talent as a writer, and it's the combination of those two things that create something bigger than the sum of its parts. So I wouldn't want to cut them out of the process. However, generating all those lines of dialogue is not only time consuming for us to write them, it's time consuming to record them, to translate them, to all of those factors just add to the budget of a game. And the bigger the budget gets, I think more people get scared about like experimenting or coming up with something dark, like some of the dark things that we were able to put in this game. So, but my point is, when voice generation gets good enough to where we can put in parameters and come up with a voice we like that then sounds convincing, then we could write maybe twice as many lines and not have to worry about that. But I wouldn't necessarily want to, I don't know. There's pros and cons, because not only do the actors bring their talent to the characters, a lot of times they find things or interpret the character in ways that you never even imagined. And unfortunately, on games, I've listened to a lot of writers who write for TV shows, and they get the opportunity to write for their actors. Mm-hmm. We had a little bit of that, but not a lot, because we did in chunks. So if we ever had to revise things, we're like, oh, we can write a little bit more, but it was very, very limited. So, and that's part of, a little bit of the downside of our process, is that once we get an actor in there interpreting our characters, we don't get a chance to write more towards their strengths, or like, oh, they're interpreting the character this way. It would be so much cooler if I tweaked it a little bit. Because there was a couple of instances where we heard the actor and we're like, that's exactly who we had in mind. That's exactly who we wrote. But there was probably an equal number of choices where we're like, wow, I never thought of that character that way, but that's really cool. And then, like I said, in TV shows, they have the ability to write more towards that. Once they find that synergy with the actor, they can then really kind of push that character in that direction. We don't have that opportunity. But if we had the ability, I mean, we think as writers, we would love to be able to just like, this is the character I want, and this is the character I want them to be. There's no surprise there anymore. There's no like sitting in a VO session with an actor and just being blown away by what they're doing with the part, and making you sound so much better, like I said.
Well, there's a ton of potential. I don't think we would be having the same conversation 7 years ago, right? Just because the idea of machine learning really hadn't broken through in terms of just mass awareness of it and how it's being applied now. So 5 years, 7 years from now, we may be having a completely different conversation about how machine learning.
You never know when that breakthrough is going to come through.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're like, oh, in 5 years, we'll be able to do this, and you're like, oh yeah, it's 20, 30 years later and it's not even close. And other times they're like, you'll never be able to fly a plane. And 3 years later or the next day, they're out there flying a plane.
Yeah. Well, that's what's great about this industry, right? I mean, in our industry is a great example of that, because we always have that pressure to improve from the players, right? This arms race just doesn't slow down, it seems.
Well, the thing that shouldn't say bothers me about that, but the thing that makes me a little sad about that, I mean, as somebody who grew up wanting to be a photorealist artist, it really, and who was unable to make photorealistic 3D characters, I marvel at what can be done in 3D now. But it also makes me sad because it takes so long and it is such a huge cost, and that limits what you can do. The better looking you make your game, unless you have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend, and even then you're limiting yourself to what you could do because of the fidelity you can now get that takes time to put together. You know, how is your engine going to push that many polygons? How are you going to build your levels to optimize that? Because it is an arms race. Our game has to look better than the next game. It's like, well, what are you sacrificing on the gameplay front?
I think just going back to Outer Worlds, I think you managed to sidestep some of that by creating a stylization that is unique, right? It could have easily been a gritty, totally photoreal, everything has to be perfect kind of game. But I thought you took some really smart liberties with how you use color palettes, how you slightly stylize the characters, what you do with your aliens, to make it all feel plausible and grounded, but different. I wasn't comparing it to a movie or a TV show.
Yeah. Well, that was part of our intent, and I have to give credit to Daniel Alpert, our art director, for a lot of that, and our concept artists, and of course the people who modeled them, and everybody down the line who added their expertise to that. But some of it was really dictated by budget and time. We knew we couldn't compete with completely photorealistic characters, and so we wanted to go a little bit more stylized, but it was up to them to find out where that balance was. And there was people, it's a polarizing thing. There's people who really don't like the look of the game, which is totally understandable. I mean, everyone's got their own personal tastes. But it's really difficult when you're developing it because, when you're in an office with a whole bunch of game developers, for the most critical people you ever meet in your life, the first character goes in, half the people are like, oh, I really don't like the stylization, or I really don't like the way we're doing this here. And so you're really trying to like stay the course, kind of like, when you're putting in original ideas, it's like, nope, just wait and see what's going to happen. So there's a little bit of that all the way through. I think whenever you kind of move away from something that's completely expected or people have seen before, there's always a little bit of like having to convince people to wait and see and reserve judgment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole package just feels great. And I hope a lot of people who are listening, if you haven't played it, you should definitely play Outer Worlds.
Thank you. I really appreciate the compliments.
Yeah. Well, so looking ahead and just talking more about your career, where do you want to go from here? Have you found exactly what it is that you want to do, having run a company, having been one of the first people aboard at Interplay, making this incredibly, this genre changing franchise? Where do you want to
go? That's a really good question. I mean, where I wanted to go after Blizzard was here to make this game, because I really wanted to work with Tim again and make a new IP. I love making new IPs. I love starting from scratch with a totally blank piece of paper. But this will be, if we are allowed to make another sequel or a sequel to this game, this will be the first time I've ever worked on a sequel, apart from Reaper of Souls, which is an expansion for Diablo. We did the original design for Fallout 2 before we left Interplay. So that was the closest I've come to actually working on a sequel. So it'd be really nice to do some more exploration in the Outer Worlds. I love the universe we've come up with. I love the feel. I love the way the characters talk. I love the look. I'm really happy with how the game came out, and the talented people we worked with did a fantastic job, and we can't thank them enough for all their contributions to the game. So it'd be really interesting to just continue seeing where we could take this franchise.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think you're right. It's rare today to have the luxury of being able to jump into a sequel.
Yeah.
Because the risks are just so high, and success that bar seems to just be pushed up every single year, right?
Yeah.
You have to clear it if you want to do a sequel.
Yeah. So, but I'm glad people are enjoying playing it. That's the most that's the most rewarding part, is shipping a game and people having a good response to it and having fun when they're playing it is the best you can hope for.
So for anybody who's listening who is also passionate about building worlds from scratch and getting in there and being the writer, the designer, you mentioned earlier that best thing to do is just make your own game, I think. Or you may have said that. I think you alluded to that. What other advice would you have for people who either are part of a team and just want to do that, just want to start with a blank sheet of paper, or people who are getting into the industry now and are asking that question? Hey, Leonard's a guy who has done it successfully with several major franchises. How could I learn from him?
That's a tough one. Because like when I started in the industry, like I was saying, that not a lot of people, there was a good number of people, but in general, it wasn't looked on like as a very successful career path. So that was a totally different industry then. And we did luck into being able to make the original Fallout. I think, the best thing you can do is to work on your own stuff, whether it's, you with a group of friends, taking something that you can mod a game, whether maybe you can't create a whole new IP from it, but maybe you can take an existing IP and make your own mod for it. And I think, if you have enough of that stuff in your portfolio, then, if you could happen on the right situation where someone's looking for that, then you could do it. The other way to do it, and this is also a good thing to build mods for or script areas for or whatever, is to use that in your portfolio to just get hired doing, an art job or a writing job or whatever. And then, work your way up at a company that is doing interesting original stuff. And then you get yourself into a position where you can be contributing to that. It's very rare that people want to start new IPs these days. I feel very fortunate to have been in the position that I'm in and that I was in when they asked me to come do this game. I didn't think I'd ever have the chance to make another new IP in my career. So I'm really appreciative of that. I wish I had much more concrete steps for people to take to get to where I am, because I love doing my job and I love being able to create this stuff. And I think that there's probably just, hundreds of thousands of people out there who could be doing, fantastic work, creating their own things if they were given the chance. But it's just, it's a small industry. Even if it seems like a huge industry, it's fairly small. It's getting more and more expensive every day to make games. I think even if you don't aspire to make your own thing, I do think the best thing to do is to try to work on a small team very early on so that you can try out all parts of it. And then I think in any aspect of the game industry, or any industry for that matter, if you just really are passionate about your work and just really work hard at what you're doing, and it's not only about being good at what you're doing, it's also about being a good person to work with. Mm-hmm. We've all known people who are fantastic at their jobs, but they're not very much fun to work with. I'd much rather work with someone who maybe wasn't as talented, but was just really great to work with and be around. So that's very important. The thing that I would have to say for me, using myself as an experience is no job is beneath you. If you want to get into the industry, take whatever you can and try to work your way up. I entered the industry, like I said, at a time when not a lot of people had art degrees. I had 2 art degrees. I felt like I really understood art. I felt like I could, create some great illustrations, which I had done in the past. And if I had been like, I'm not going to cut characters out of backgrounds, that's beneath me, I wouldn't be where I am today, because I was in that building when they had those SGIs just sitting around. And I'm like, yes, granted, I was so sick of cutting out characters from backgrounds. If I hadn't have made the transition, I probably would have left. But if I hadn't been doing that job, I wouldn't have been in that position to then get to the next place. And I easily could have just turned my nose up at it and said, I don't want to do this. I went to school for this so many years to get a degree, and this is beneath me, but I didn't. I went in there and I did as good a job as I can and as I could. And that, not only staying late and pursuing 3D art on my own, but also because people knew that I was dependable and they liked working with me, contributed as much to the fact that I actually learned how to do 3D art. To being able to progress.
That is great advice. So if people have additional questions for you or want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
You could write to Obsidian. They generally forward us a lot of those things. I also have a website that's very hard to remember. It's leonardboyarsky.com. It's great to have a name that not a lot of people have. And you can contact me through there. I can't always guarantee I will write back. But people have sent me interesting questions over the years, and I've tried to answer as many as I could. So that's probably a good way as well. But our PR department, our marketing department at Obsidian is really good about passing those along if you just send them to them at Obsidian.
Fantastic. Leonard, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a great time.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.